The lecture from March 2021 for Pathwork Steps online groups, meetings, and newsletters is Spiritual Fearlessness. That's the summary of the title. Pathwork Lecture 146, the full title, a little wordy, is The Positive Concept of Life, Fearlessness to Love, and the Balance Between Activity and Passivity. The guide lists 3 conditions for fearlessness, and so I use them as the titles of the subtopics for that month. And they are, the 3 conditions for fearlessness are, number 1, a positive concept of the universe as benign, as a benign force, and for there to be a benign fate for mankind. Secondly, the freedom and fearlessness to love. And third, a healthy balance between activity and passivity. The positive concept of the universe as benign, as a benign force, goes against the grain of complaining and giving in to fear. Meaning, in normal conversation, in cultural trends, there is a tendency to feel that the universe is against us, that we must fight to exist, fight to survive. This is a distortion of the grain of truth. Now, you can't teach one concept without delving into another, so I'm going to have to bring in activity versus passivity here. To survive, you must eat. To eat, you must pick up a fork, put the food in your mouth. You must go to the refrigerator. You may have to prepare the food. In the beginning of civilization, you had to find the food, grow the food, kill the food, drag it back to the cave. So that there was more actual activity involved in your survival than there may seem to be today. And yet, we work for the money to pay for our food. So that the complexity of modern life, it's like having a tapestry or a woven material that's become entangled and ensnarled. Not easy to see these concepts sometimes. They blend, one goes into the other. To have a positive concept of the universe as divine, as benign, requires to some extent that, here's what happened to me, is I suddenly got an idea, and so the place I was going to go, I couldn't go, I paused, I stumbled, so I'm going to go where I was called to go. A lot of anthropologists, a lot of zoologists are beginning to understand that life was not as desperate for human beings as we imagined it to be. So from our civilized universe, we saw people going out and hunting bears, dragging them back to the cave as being a very difficult and fraught life. What is being discovered is that they did that, they dried the food, they made arrangements, they used all the parts of the bear, they went out and got another bear. It wasn't as desperate, it wasn't as poverty laden as modern man may think it is, simply because we had nothing else better to do. So there wasn't television, there wasn't a theater to go to, there wasn't knitting per se to do. We needed the bear to provide the materials for us to do the equivalent of knitting, of making things. We needed those materials, so that there was a unification of the process of getting food and making use of materials, and then with what leisure you had, enjoying playing dice with parts of the vertebra or pieces of bone. Zoologists are realizing that the phrase busy as a bee is not as valid as we have used that phrase to mean. Meaning, bees don't spend all their time working. They just don't. They have time for play and time for leisure. Birds aren't constantly foraging for food. They may be out flying around, but they aren't eating all the time. There's not, once again, a desperation about survival that people project onto other animals, cultures, and situations. This projection that life is dangerous and that you have to work hard to survive is the effect of a feeling that the universe isn't benign, that you can't just survive. Now, there's a cause and effect scenario. I tend to enjoy science and facts. I find that they back up spiritual principles and they explain discrepancies. So I use them a lot. We have a certain number of people on the planet because we've gotten very efficient about feeding ourselves. If we hadn't gotten that efficient, we would have not bred as much. We would not have generated as many people. They would have starved. There is an innate knowing in animal populations about when it's time to not breed, when it's time to slow down. And there is an acceptance of death, an acceptance of bad times and good times. But for man who thinks that he can control his destiny, the fact that he can't do what he wants to do means there's a negative force acting against him instead of a benign balance in the universe. So there's a prejudice that we hold that motivates our activity, which makes us feel more in control. And what I'm describing is a cause and effect that can be very subtle, a cause and effect dynamic that we create in order to feel self-important. So when the guide makes the suggestion, the universe is benign, it pulls the plug on our motivational speeches. It says we don't have to, and therefore we have to take the responsibility to choose, which is part of being active and passive, and I'll come to that in a moment. But if the universe is benign, that artificial motivator dissolves if we accept it. And we can be attached to that artificial motivator. And for me, that's why I find people resist consciously and unconsciously the idea that the universe is benign, that there is simply a balance and you have to work with the balance. Indigenous cultures all over the world have found it very easy to work with the balance. Western civilization in particular has found a pride, a willfulness, a joy, a pleasure in overcoming adversity, in not bowing to natural balance, but overcoming it. And while this can be an important developmental step, seeing the divine universe is another step to take, another level in development, not to negate building our activity. I very often do a muscle pumping thing when I give meetings because people can see me on Zoom now. It's important to build these muscles, but not so you can continue to do the same calisthenics. You build the muscles so you can do something with the muscles. So as a developmental step, we may have had to develop our self-will, our active principle, our willingness, our eagerness to act. And then there comes a time of rebalancing, of finding a new balance between the active and the passive. So, as a condition for fearlessness, the invitation here is you're going to need to see the universe as benign, because otherwise you would be afraid of it. So to see the universe as benign. The second is to have the freedom and fearlessness to love. There's always a rebuttal to that suggestion, as if, but of course I want to love. I invite you to consider that, of course I want to love, is actually, of course I want relationship. Of course I want comfort. Of course I want a family. Of course I want stability. But this discussion is about love? Do you really want to love? And if you want love, that implies you want to receive love. And what we're looking at here is, are you willing to give love? So in order to give love, you have to believe, number one, that the universe is benign, that nobody is going to attack you for giving, or you're not going to run out, that there's more love to replace what you're giving. That's part of the benign quality, that nobody is going to say you gave it away, you can't have anymore. So a fearlessness to love involves truly being able to open your heart and allow love and develop love. Develop that muscle of opening your heart and allowing it to engage. So the freedom and fearlessness, freedom meaning you don't constrict it. And secondly, fearlessness meaning you don't have a deep-seated fear, unconscious fear that will tug at it and not allow it to bloom, to be what it is. The third is a healthy balance between activity and passivity. I found that that stage was a bigger aspect of this lecture than I realized. The guide says that, for instance, in the reality of the highest state of consciousness, the state of being, both activity and passivity intermingle. It is artificial to separate them. We very often separate something in order to study its unique characteristics and qualities, but that's an artifice. Passivity and activity are not distinguishable. They are interwoven. It's the yin-yang quality. So in the Western civilization, science-minded aspect of take it apart, dissect it, and look at each piece, it's similar to taking an animal apart, dissecting it to look at its elements. That's fine, but it's not the living animal. You had to kill the animal to see all the pieces. So it's an artifice that can help educate and help an understanding. But it's the dynamic interaction that is actual life itself. So that in actual life, activity and passivity flow in a way that are very often indistinguishable. Therefore, they need to balance. Now, what happens very often in our experience is our experience may reflect a period of imbalance, whereby we then condemn aspects of our life that created the imbalance or were produced by the imbalance or are evidentiary of the imbalance. Spiritual work is about constantly seeing things in a bigger and bigger and bigger context. So that, yes, 10 years ago I was unbalanced, and that enabled me to explore an area that I now feel that I have an understanding and some, I'm going to use the word control in terms of I understand the dynamics of it. So I'm not ignorant of that area. I spend a lot of time there. And as I rebalance my interests, I may go into another interest. Dynamic balance is not being firmly in the center. It's not being static. It's not about good or bad. Balance is about what works for you, what you wish to do, and to accept that there's a counterbalance effect. If you drink nothing but water for 10 hours, you will urinate a great deal. It may be necessary, it may be important, it may be valuable for you to drink liters and liters, gallons of water for a period of 10 hours, and there will be consequences. As long as we understand and are willing to work with the consequences, it is not necessarily bad that we are out of balance. The consequences will tend to pull us back into balance. And so what I'm describing is why it can seem like there's more of one than the other. But even in a human life, a decade can be like a snapshot. During this decade, I was like this. During a previous decade, I was like that. And once again, if we try to see things in a bigger context, there's a dynamic in the decades, sometimes in the sequence, but sometimes just in the accumulated experience that those decades represent. So the balance between activity and passivity. What would be the negative of passive? It is not doing. What is the attraction of that? Because we wouldn't do it if it wasn't attractive. The attraction of not doing is that it feels like being. So we have these superficial aspects of being enlightened by doing nothing. It doesn't work, but it feels like it. It's the most we can do at the moment. It gives us a taste. So there's an attraction to passivity. The other thing about passivity is we don't have to take responsibility. We just sit. We just are. So it can be an excuse. The positive of passive is that it's the counterbalance of integrating what happens when we're active. If you're nothing but active, you don't integrate. Passivity is the equivalent of digestion, which, by the way, is a highly active process as far as the stomach and the intestines are concerned. But to the outer shell of us, we're done. We ate, we don't think about it anymore. So the perception of active and passive influences our favoring one or the other and our understanding of one or the other. So again, the negative of passive is we don't get anything done. The attraction is it looks like being. The divine aspect is that it is an integrative, it has the potential for integration, and that it is a state of just being. That's how you notice what you want to do next. Now, activity. What is the negative of activity? Keeps you busy, keeps you distracted, doesn't give you time to think. Makes you think you're doing something when you may not be doing something, gives you accomplishments that counterbalance other accomplishments that you may actually prefer, but you're so busy and so feeling so successful about what you're doing that you don't have time to reflect on what you're not doing until it's time passes and you have some regrets. Evidence piles up. The negative of activity is that it requires a goal direction and a sense of responsibility. For me to do something, I have to decide what to do, and I have to take responsibility for doing it. So there's a tendency not to be active because it requires those two things. Just as there is a tendency to be active in terms of avoidance. What is the divine positive of activity? It is those very things. It is a manifestation of, even if it's only a phase of development, of a goal direction. It is a step. If you want to take the final step, you've got to take the first step and the middle step. So the divine aspect of active is to begin to take steps or continue to take steps, and also to take responsibility. If you took the action and then you take responsibility for the action, then you sit and you look at the pieces and you just can decide intelligently, spiritually, ethically, morally, what do I want to do next, even if it's about changing direction. So we both don't want to do those, and that's the invitation in doing those. So that's a bit about the balance between active and passive. There are also some questions and answers about gender, male energy, female energy, because the guide describes the female feminine principle as receptive. Receptive is not the same as passive. Receptive is the active principle within passive. Describes the masculine principle as active or creative, which also requires looking, seeing, pausing, requires receptivity. It's a balance. And that engenders We may have different balances because we're trying to counterbalance previous incarnations. We're trying to accomplish certain things that require starting with one foot and then continuing with the other. So that a woman can have masculine energy, that's not a mistake. That's a way of grounding the masculine in the feminine, just as a man can be a man by gender and then spend a lifetime exploring the feminine by having a foot in that masculine energy. The details of how much you have is more about where you're led from the inner divine within you than about any outer circumstance. Now, I want to go back during week 3, which was I diverged into transforming character defects, and there were 3 steps listed. Why would we transform character defects? Because our character defect would lead us to not have a positive concept of the universe, to be afraid to love, and to overemphasize or underemphasize, either active or passive. So if you have a character defect that is interfering with this freedom to be fearless, how do you change that? The guide lists 3 steps. And he says the first step is always awareness of these defects. I'm going to digress a second. I have a favorite lecture, Passivity Lecture 127, which is about 4 stages of spiritual evolution. Step 1 is you don't know, so you can't work there. It's lack of awareness. Second step is awareness. Guide says that awareness is the longest and most painful stage. That's the working phase. You have to be aware to begin to stage 3 understand, but you have to go back and forth. And as awareness increases, more understanding is needed, so that it's a dynamic cycle that grows and grows until stage 4, the penny drops, and you know. I always invite people to see these principles in the areas of their life where if they apply them, they work and you're done. In those areas of your life, you don't have a negative current. You don't have a spiritual defect. You have a simple character defect. If you are making your capital G's incorrectly and you simply decide to change, you can change that. No matter how ingrained the habit is, you can change it. But if there's something inside you that doesn't want to make a capital G, or capital G reminds you of God, and so you cringe from the capital G, no amount of training is going to address that deeper issue. It's not a simple habit, but there are thousands and thousands of things that we learn, even as adults, every day that we find easy. We don't notice them, they're so easy. During one of the meetings last week, one of the participants offered that a few minutes prior, a participant who was sharing gave an example of seeing something that was green. And the woman who was listening was sitting in her room, and her room was in neutrals. There were white walls, cream bed cover, beige rug, mild light. One would not think that there was significant color in the room: golds, beiges, creams, whites. But the minute she heard the word green, she suddenly noticed the green within a very pastel beigey flower decoration. She noticed the plant in the room. And by the time it came to her turn, she was saying, it was an exciting sharing because she had realized that simply being brought into consciousness by the word green, her perception of the room she was sitting in completely changed. She was seeing green everywhere. And it was a lovely metaphor for how you can find a concept and how fast it can manifest and come into your consciousness and become a part of you if you're not resistant to it. That's the trick. So she wasn't resistant to seeing green. My invitation is find some areas where you go through these steps as the guide lists them, where you are already fearless, where you already believe the universe is benign, where you already feel a lovely, relaxed balance between activity and passivity. Even if you're unbalanced in the moment, you're not anxious about it. Now, find those areas where you are comfortable with the principles and comfortable with the steps, and then take those steps and apply them gently to an area that doesn't work. The trick is that we're working in areas, the work is to work in areas that don't work. So it's not where it does work, but those can be great ways to find, gee, it works over here, why doesn't it work over here? So in transforming character defects, the first step is to become aware of these defects, such as hearing the defect and then looking for it and becoming aware of it. And it becomes like the lovely example of green in the room, you see it. Then what, and that's the second step, or it leads to the second step. Once you're aware of the specific defects, understand the reason for their existence. Now, I gave a silly example, changing the way you write a capital G. It may seem bizarre to consider that capital G is often used for the word God, and that we have issues with God. That seems childish. But sometimes the simple answers are an interesting place to explore. So in understanding the reason for their existence, first you've got to see them, and then you need to look at the evidence and consider, why would that happen? Why would I resist that? What could make me resist that? It's sometimes working with other people, working with a helper, a therapist, or a friend, or a group. The help there is that the other person doesn't have your blind spots. The other person does not automatically turn away from the answer. So sometimes it can seem to a stranger obvious what you're avoiding. And that leads to the guide suggesting that when you're looking for character defects, ask somebody else. That can feel terrifying. It's outlined in Patrick Lecture 26, which is actually called Finding Your Faults. But of course, you would go to someone who was not dangerous to you, who you do not see as a threat. Of course, you would go to a friend, someone who loves you dearly and whom you would trust to be gentle and loving and caring and point out faults that don't destroy the relationship just because they're spoken, but who may bring up things that they would love to tell you that annoy them, whether they see are damaging you or inhibiting you, and they haven't had the opportunity. So once you're aware of the specific defects, understand the reason for their existence, share that with other people. Why would you think that I'm afraid of bears? Why would you think that I avoid the color green in my home? Why don't I make the capital G? What does the capital G remind you of? Because they might be able to say the word when you can't even think of the word. Understand the reason for their existence. To understand why you cling to the character defect. Character defects are a defense. They're a solution. They're a way of avoiding something. If I don't get up in the morning, I don't feel what? The emptiness of the room, the silence. If I get up earlier in the morning, I'm not motivated to get going, so I waste time and I wind up being late. What is the reason for the character defect? Find the reason for them. Find what it does for you, as well as what it avoids. So the guide suggests that a negative assumption is taken for granted. So he says, when you look objectively and deeply, you will find that in each specific instance, a fault or defect is supposed to ward off something that you assume will happen to you. A negative assumption that's taken for granted. It becomes an unconscious paradigm in your life. You don't see it, you don't explain it to others, and your friends, you wind up with friends who don't mind, so they don't bring it up to you all the time. My friends have accepted my defects and they don't harp on them. People who are not my friends do tend to mention my defects more often. And I can blame, well, they don't like me anyway. But the truth is, they didn't choose me as a friend. They got stuck with me as a work colleague. My friends chose me because of my virtues, my support. The danger is they also chose me because my character defect matches some of their character defects, and neither one of us talks about it. So it's a complex picture. Third step in transforming character defects is once you see this negative assumption, this reason for your flaw, question the validity of it. Pathwork is about challenge and confrontation. First, we read the lectures and we're challenged and confronted by what the guide tells us. Then we need to take that challenge and confrontation and have a conversation with ourselves and confront ourselves. People ask me sometimes how I deal with an issue. It used to be back in the 50s and 60s that there was a joke that if you talk to yourself, you're crazy. Perhaps that was an outgrowth of the more recent knowledge of mental illness, so that people were learning so much about schizophrenia that it was a bigger issue. Schizophrenia was identified by imagining people in the room with you. So once again, it became a common joke. If you talk to yourself, you're crazy. I think we're over that. Talking to yourself is what we all do, and some of us verbalize it if we're alone in a room or if we think nobody's listening. I used to get caught by people saying, "What did you say?" And I realized I was talking to myself. It was actually coming out loud. So question this assumption, do some confrontation with yourself, have some dialogues. Pathwork tends to invite different aspects of our character, persona, and spiritual being, give them a name: higher self, lower self, observer self, divine self, real self, ego. Give them names. Once again, just like I described activity and passivity, you separate for the purpose of understanding their qualities, but none of these things that I named, real self, ego, higher self, lower, none of these exist as a standalone. Just like my arm does not exist as a separate entity, but I can describe the arm in its details. But its purpose is to connect to my torso and be used. Otherwise, my arm lies on a pathologist's table and does me no good whatsoever. So when you have a conversation with yourself, when you confront, when you check, self-analysis is a highly active process, and confrontation also requires periods where you're not thinking about it, and then the answer leaps home. We've all experienced that. It's when you're not looking for the name of the movie or the name of the ingredient, and you're looking someplace else, that it comes forward. So even this represents the balance of active and passive. It represents fearlessness to love, because this is a loving act. It needs to be loving, not an attack or criticism or an intent to harm or hurt or have hidden agendas in it. We know our hidden agendas. Even if we don't name them, we know a hidden agenda and we dodge it. And this also includes believing that the universe is benign, believing that this confrontation of ourselves, this looking at character defects, is going to allow us to enter more fully into life, and that this process will have a benign quality to it. That does not mean that you will never experience disharmony. There's a difference. I want to make a distinction. A benign universe means that when you are in untruth, when you are driven by negativity, when you are holding a negative agenda, disharmony and misery will result. The game, and I do like to call it a game because I see the universe as benign. It's a game that I can win, a game that I can lose, meaning I have to take a few steps backward on the board and learn some more things so that I can advance again. That's the kind of benign I'm speaking of, not benign in the sense of everything is good, everything is wonderful, everything is easy. That's a fantasy. A spiritual life is active. A spiritual life requires strength, determination, a willingness to engage. So these are the aspects of transforming character defects. Two other things were addressed in the lecture. I went into this not realizing how many ideas were in it. Sometimes it's hard to package in a standard study guide. Two other aspects. One is that feelings can change. This is important. I feel this way is very often presented as a defense, as a final statement. I feel this way, flat. That's how I feel. Feelings can change. Feelings communicate something. So that instead of changing the feelings, we need to look at where the feelings came from, where they were generated, what generated them. And we work on that. And then we allow the feelings to organically evolve with the new situation. But if you allow your feelings to rule your life, then to some extent, you'll never go in and find out what's generating the energy that the feelings are responding to. So feelings can change because the organic underlayment, the organic, I'm losing words here, but I'm sure you get it. I'm going to let that go. The other was a discussion of vicious circles. Vicious circles is a lecture, Catholic Lecture 50. It's a useful tool. And I have a worksheet in the study guide, and I have a way of describing a vicious circle that allows people to just fill in the blanks for themselves rather than trying to invent a vicious circle. There's a dynamic to a vicious circle described in the lecture. So this was a summary of Patrick Lecture 146, Spiritual Fearlessness, the positive concept of life, fearlessness to love, and the balance between activity and passivity. It was entertaining. I enjoyed it. I hope you'll take a look at it. Thank you for listening.